6 words ended one of the most celebrated runs in gospel music history, and the man who spoke them didn't raise his voice, didn't elaborate, and didn't seem to feel the need to. Guy Penrod sat across from a regional television host in 2014, hands folded, and when the question came about why he walked away from the Gaither Vocal Band, he paused long enough that the room grew uncomfortable. Then he said it, quietly and without decoration. My family needed me to come home. The host moved on. The gospel press moved on. But those 6 words, sitting in an interview that most fans never caught because it aired on a small regional program, carry a weight that years of additional explanation couldn't fully equal. What nobody thought to ask was the question underneath the question. Not why he left, but what it had actually cost him to stay as long as he did, and what it cost Angie and their 8 children every time he wasn't there. This is the version of that story told in pieces across nearly a decade of interviews, quiet conversations, and moments of rare honesty from Guy himself. When you pull those pieces together, the picture that comes into focus is more human and more honest than the clean narrative the gospel world settled on. And the part that stayed private the longest isn't the dramatic part. It's the part that resonates most. Guy Penrod came into living rooms across America the way very few artists ever manage. No breakout single, no flashy debut, or just year after year of showing up on the Gaither homecoming videos that became something close to a weekly ritual for an entire generation of Christian families rooted in evangelical faith. He joined the Gaither Vocal Band in 1994, stepping into a group already deeply beloved, and what nobody fully anticipated was how completely his voice would come to define that era. That baritone, enormous and warm, and carrying the kind of reach that made audiences feel like the walls had moved slightly, wasn't something listeners admired from a distance. They felt it. When fans picture the Gaither Vocal Band at its peak, they picture Guy Penrod at that microphone, hat on, eyes closed, singing like every single word was personally true. Because for him, it was. Everyone who worked alongside him during those years said the same thing. What you heard was what he was, a man of real faith, rooted in Texas, rooted in family, rooted in a way of believing that never needed to be announced because it had already become the ground underneath everything else. He grew up in Abilene, grandson of a preacher, and that religious lineage wasn't background detail in his biography. It shaped how he understood music itself, not as art for its own sake, but as something that carried something larger than itself, a vessel for a truth bigger than the voice producing it. Oral Roberts University trained and refined what was already present, but the foundation existed long before any classroom touched it. It had been built in church pews and around family tables, and in the particular kind of Christian faith that doesn't require performance, because it has already become the architecture of a person's daily life. When Bill Gaither recognized him in the early 90s, he wasn't discovering raw material and building something new from scratch. He was recognizing something already fully formed in its essential character. The voice needed the stage. The faith was already there, and audiences could tell the difference between someone performing conviction and someone who actually had it. For nearly 17 years, Guy held the center of that group, singing alongside David Phelps, Mark Lowry, Michael English, Russ Taff, and Wes Hampton, a rotating constellation of some of the greatest voices in Christian music. Through all of it, he stayed constant. Fans trusted him. Bill Gaither trusted him. By every outward measure, nothing was going to change, but something had been building quietly for longer than most people realized, and it had almost nothing to do with music, or ministry, or creative direction. What Guy Penrod's life actually looked like during those 17 years of touring is the part of this story that deserves far more attention than it received. He and Angie had 8 children, Not 2, not 3, 8 children, spanning different ages, different needs, different stages of growing up. While Guy was on the road through stretches that would exhaust someone half his age, Angie was holding everything together at home in Tennessee. She has spoken about those years in interviews, carefully and without bitterness, but with a clarity that deserves to be heard plainly. The Gaither touring schedule during that era was not casual or occasional. Arenas were filling. Homecoming videos were being filmed constantly. Recordings kept arriving on schedule. And Guy was present for all of it professionally, even as the demands of raising 8 children at home in Tennessee continued to compound in ways that touring calendars simply don't accommodate. Think about what that arithmetic actually looks like inside a real family. 8 children at different stages, school events, ordinary Tuesday evenings, the small daily moments that never appear in any interview, but that children carry in their memory for the rest of their lives. Whether a father walked through the door, whether he was there for the things that mattered before they stopped mattering. Oh, Angie carried those years with a faithfulness that deserves its own recognition, and she has never sought credit for it. But Guy knew what it weighed. Men of genuine conscience know things like that, quietly and persistently, with a growing awareness that something needs to change before the window closes for good. He never complained publicly, and that's simply not who Guy Penrod is. But watching those years in retrospect, certain things become visible that weren't clear at the time. Interviews where he talked about his children with something underneath the pride that sounded very close to longing. Moments on stage where, if you watch carefully, something behind the eyes goes deeper than the music, deeper than the performance of worship, into somewhere more private. By 2012 and into 2013, he was in his mid-40s, from carrying something the road had produced and the road could not cure. Not only physical exhaustion, though that was real, but something spiritual and emotional, stretched in a direction that only gets worse the longer a person refuses to name it. In conversations after leaving the group, Guy began speaking about a conviction that had grown in him over time. His first ministry wasn't the stage. It was his home, his wife, his children. He used language that resonated immediately with the audience that knew him best. Language of calling, of stewardship, of being faithful to what God had placed directly in front of you, rather than what the world could see and applaud. In 2018, he put it plainly. He felt like he was giving his best hours to people who already knew the Lord, and giving whatever hours were left to the people God had given him to raise. That sentence stayed with people who heard it, not because it indicts the Gaither ministry, it doesn't, but because it reveals a man who had come to believe the season had changed, and that faithfulness in this new chapter meant something different than faithfulness in the one before. The theology underneath that conviction is one this community will recognize without needing it explained. The understanding, rooted in Scripture and in a lifetime of lived Christian faith, that what God calls you to in one chapter isn't necessarily what He calls you to in the next. Obedience isn't static. The most faithful choice in a given moment isn't always the one that looks the most faithful from the outside. That position isn't comfortable. It makes real demands. And in Guy's case, those demands asked him to surrender something most men in his position would have found extremely difficult to let go. In 2013, Guy stepped away from the Gaither Vocal Band. The announcement was handled with grace on every side. Bill Gaither spoke warmly about the years and what they had meant. Guy spoke warmly about the ministry and what it had given him. The gospel world received the news with sadness, but acceptance. Most fans assumed it was simply time for a solo career, new music, new stages, and that was true as far as it went. What it left out was the part that mattered most. What nobody expected was what the departure actually looked like in practice. No rupture, no conflict, no falling out behind closed doors that later got smoothed over for public consumption. What happened was quieter, and, in many ways, more honest than any dramatic exit would have been. Guy Penrod walked away from one of the most beloved positions in gospel music at what was, by every external measure, the height of his reach and influence. He wasn't struggling professionally. He wasn't being eased out. He was wanted, and Bill Gaither had built something around voices like his that made the absence immediately felt. That fact became clearer in the years that followed, because nobody came in and filled that particular space in quite the same way. But Guy went home. His debut solo album arrived in 2014 and made clear from the first listen that this chapter wasn't going to be a smaller version of what came before. Something in the music had shifted quality, turned more intimate, more confessional, more like a man singing from a place of settled peace rather than accumulated applause. Fans who had worried the Gaither departure would diminish him heard the opposite. The voice was fuller. The conviction ran deeper. A settledness had come into the recordings that listeners recognized without being able to name it immediately. The sound of someone who had stopped performing for approval and started singing from somewhere much more personal. Angie confirmed in her own words what Guy had been saying across those post-departure years. The road had taken something. The years at home had given something back. She described the transition not as a loss, but as a restoration, and that single word held everything that needed to be said. Their children, grown now or nearly so, have spoken in various settings about a father who showed up, who was present in the ways that actually mattered, who was there. That's the actual story of why Guy Penrod left the Gaither Vocal Band. Not a scandal, not a conflict, not a health crisis, though the road eventually collects its toll from every body that travels it, long enough. A man at 46 years old decided that the most important stage in his life sat inside his own house, and that the most important audience shared his last name. For everyone who has followed his journey since the mid-90s, since the first time that voice came through a television speaker on a Sunday afternoon, this story carries particular weight. This community knows what faithfulness costs in practical terms. Many people who have followed Guy across decades have made sacrifices nobody recorded or applauded, chosen the unglamorous right thing over the visible celebrated one. When a man standing on the stage Guy was standing on makes that choice, it registers differently than when it comes from someone the world hasn't been watching. Bill Gaither could have taken the departure personally, as a judgment on the touring schedule or the ministry's demands. By every account available, he didn't. What he said publicly, and what those around him confirmed privately, was that he understood, respected it, and remained a friend. Years after the departure, at a homecoming concert where Guy returned for a reunion appearance, Bill introduced him back to that stage, with an expression that went well past professional warmth. It was the face of a man genuinely glad to see someone he cared about. The professional arrangement ended. The relationship didn't. The bridge didn't burn. And perhaps more than anything else in this story, that reflects what both men actually believe about the Christian faith they've spent their lives putting into music. At 61 years old, Guy Penrod carries his age the way singers carry years well spent. The voice hasn't diminished. Age and experience have given it something that couldn't have been manufactured earlier, a depth that only comes from having lived through the things worth singing about. His solo work continues. His family has grown. The man who walked away from one stage to be faithful to a more important one shows no outward sign of regret about the choice he made, and the people closest to him don't suggest there's any hidden there. He once said his greatest hope wasn't to be remembered as a great singer, but to be remembered as a good father. So by the accounts of the people whose opinion actually counted in that question, He achieved the thing he was actually after. That's a rarer outcome than it sounds. And it says something worth carrying about what a life well spent actually looks like, when the applause stopped being the measure a long time ago.